August 17th, 1943. 10 a.m. Sunlight glared off contrails, stretched across a clear German sky. Hundreds of silver aircraft crawled eastward, engines droning like distant thunder. To the men of Jagdgeschwader 26, it looked like slow-moving prey, big, clumsy, and doomed. Colonel Adolf Galland lowered his binoculars and laughed through his cigarette smoke. "Langsam wie ein Bus," he said, slow as a bus. The laughter didn't last long. Below, on the grass airfields, the hunters started their engines. The Messerschmitts lifted off, climbing hard into the blue. They were flying towards something they didn't understand, a new kind of enemy, one that didn't fight like prey, one that would turn the sky into a fern, the B-17 flying fortress. 4 engines, 10 men, 13 guns. Its name sounded like propaganda, the sort of boast Americans love to make. But the first Germans who attacked one stopped laughing. Lieutenant Kurt Wusthof dove on a fortress from 30,000 feet, cannons blazing. He saw his shells explode against the target's fuselage, and nothing happened. The bomber didn't flinch. It didn't even slow down. Then the nose erupted with fire. 8.50 caliber guns hammered at once, the air between them glowing with tracers. He felt the impacts tear through his plane. The right wing came apart. He bailed out into cold, thin air, his parachute snapping open just above the fields. When he hit the ground, villagers ran to help him. He just shook his head. "It's not a bomber," he said. "It's a warship." The fortress wasn't supposed to exist. Boeing engineers had been told to build a bomber that could fly 1,000 miles, carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, and still outrun fighters. They didn't build a miracle. They built math. The B-17's frame was all geometry and strength, overlapping ribs of aluminum that could flex, twist, and still hold together. 4 Wright Cyclone engines pulled it through the stratosphere. The crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunners were parts of one machine. Each had a station, a field of fire, a role to keep the others alive. When the first fortresses arrived in England, the Luftwaffe mocked them. They were too slow, too high, too obvious. But then came the first missions over France. The German fighters attacked from behind, confident as always. They didn't expect the air itself to turn into lead. Dozens of .50 cals opened up at once, arcs of tracer fire crossing the sky like a net of light. Pilots flew straight into it. Planes disintegrated. The ones who survived returned to base in silence. To fly a B-17 was to live in a storm. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped below -50. Frost crept along the cockpit windows. Oxygen masks froze from the crew's breath. Men worked in gloves stiff with ice. Fingers blackened and broke. The air was thin, the sound constant, a mixture of vibration and fear. Every gunner had the same nightmare, hearing the gun jam, looking down at his hands and seeing skin stuck to the metal. When the fighters came, there was no time to think. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high," someone would yell through the intercom. The plane shuddered as bullets slammed into the fuselage. The tail gunner screamed. He had one on him. The navigator swore the next burst went straight through the map table. Every man had a job, and every job meant staying alive 1 second longer. A single B-17 could spit 13,000 bullets per minute. A whole squadron could fill a mile of sky with lead. The Germans soon learned there was no safe angle to attack. Head-on runs turned suicidal. Rear attacks ended in fire. Heinrich Bahr, one of the Luftwaffe's best, said it bluntly: "You fire, and it fires back harder. If you live, you don't attack again." But the fortresses weren't invincible. Every mission took its toll. The air crews saw entire formations vanish into cloud and smoke, yet the survivors tightened their ranks, flying wingtip to wingtip, a living wall of aluminum and courage. Each man trusted the others completely. Their formation wasn't just strategy, it was faith. At 25,000 feet, war moved differently. Bullets traveled farther. Time stretched. You didn't see faces, only flashes of light and trails of smoke. The bombers didn't dogfight. They endured. The German fighters had speed, agility, grace. The fortresses had gravity. They couldn't escape, but they didn't have to. All they needed was to reach the target and drop the bombs. Everything else was noise. In the summer of 1943, the Americans launched their biggest gamble yet, the raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Hundreds of fortresses rose into the sky. German radar watched them come hour after hour. The fighters scrambled again and again, attacking in waves. The sky turned black with flak bursts and contrails. 60 bombers didn't come home. The rest limped back to England full of holes, engines coughing, landing gear collapsing on the runways. The crews climbed out, kissed the ground, and said nothing. The Germans called it a victory. They were wrong. The factories in Regensburg burned for days. The Americans built new planes before the smoke cleared. For every fortress that fell, 10 more were already on the assembly line. The Luftwaffe could win battles. It could not win math. By the end of 1943, the German pilots stopped laughing. They started praying. Intelligence reports no longer called the B-17 slow and vulnerable. They called it a flying fortress of death. Attackers returned to base with their wings shredded and their nerves gone. Some refused to fly again. The Luftwaffe's aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. The war in the sky had changed. Speed no longer mattered. The future belonged to whoever could stay in the air the longest. And at 25,000 feet, the B-17 ruled the air like a judge, slow, unstoppable, and merciless. It wasn't fast. It wasn't pretty. But when it arrived, the world below caught fire. Hell didn't come screaming out of the clouds. It came humming, steady, and patient. At 290 mil, they called it the combat box. Rows upon rows of B-17s, flying so tight that a man could look out his side window and count the rivets on the next bomber's wing. The formation wasn't just discipline. It was armor made of geometry. Each fortress covered another's blind spot until the sky itself became a machine, cold, symmetrical, and lethal. Below them, Germany burned. The Luftwaffe tried everything: head-on attacks, vertical dives, cannon shells filled with phosphorus, rockets. They came in screaming, 4, 6, 10 at a time, firing through their own smoke. The fortresses didn't dodge. They couldn't. They just kept flying straight, guns hammering. The air filled with tracers, smoke, and fragments of men and metal. When one bomber went down, the hole in the formation closed instantly, another ship sliding into its place like a chess piece. No words were needed. The lesson was carved into every crewman's mind. If the formation breaks, you die. Inside, it was another world. The smell of burnt oil, sweat, and cordite. The sound of engines rattling through the hull like the heartbeat of some giant animal. The radio hissed with clipped words and static. Oxygen masks frosted from every breath. At altitude, even speaking hurt. Each word came out in gasps. Frost glittered on the inside of the windows like sugar. The tail gunner sat in a bubble of glass the size of a coffin, spinning his turret, searching for shapes in the haze. The waist gunners stood barefoot on shell casings, feeding ammo belts until their hands bled. When a shell hit nearby, the entire plane shuddered, and the men prayed the vibration meant survival, not the beginning of a fall. Below them, flak burst in black clouds, flowers of smoke blooming with orange hearts. The fragments sounded like hail on a tin roof. Sometimes a piece of shrapnel punched through the fuselage and kept going, slicing through one man and out the other side. The medic said there was nothing to be done. At 25,000 feet, blood froze before it hit the floor. Still, the pilots kept their hands steady on the controls. They had one order: hold the line until the bombs dropped. No weaving, no climbing, no turning. Just trust that the man next to you was just as scared and just as stubborn. It was obedience carved out of terror. The bombs dropped by clockwork. At the signal, the bays opened, and the aircraft exhaled. Chains of steel fell away, thousands of feet through clear air. From the ground, it looked slow, almost gentle. Then the delay ended, and entire city blocks disappeared in red dust. The shock waves rolled up into the sky, lifting the fortresses like leaves in a storm. The men inside felt it through their boots, through their ribs. They never looked down for long. By late 1943, the raids came daily. Hamburg, Bremen, Berlin. The Germans started calling it Der Luftkrieg ohne Pause, the war without pause. Factories were hit, rebuilt, and hit again before the paint on the new walls dried. Rail yards vanished overnight. The roads filled with refugees. From 25,000 feet, it all looked the same. Gray smoke, black scars, endless fire. German fighter pilots began to understand the real enemy wasn't the bomber in front of them. It was the system behind it. The Americans could replace planes faster than the Luftwaffe could bury their dead. Every destroyed fortress was another order at the Boeing plant, another shift of women riveting aluminum at midnight in Seattle. The sky had become an assembly line. The front line wasn't a trench. It was production. The B-17 crews paid for every mission in blood. Some planes came back with half their crew dead, others with wings shredded and engines on fire. There were rules of thumb. 25 missions meant a ticket home, if you lived. Most didn't make it past 12. On base, empty bunks multiplied faster than replacements. The smell of burned oil followed every survivor into sleep. And yet, they went up again. Pilots with shaking hands. Gunners who couldn't stop flinching at thunder. They climbed back into their ships, said the same jokes, checked the same guns, and waited for takeoff. It wasn't courage anymore. It was habit. It was the understanding that quitting wouldn't stop the war, but flying might end it faster. In Germany, civilians learned to read the sky. The distant hum of 4-engine bombers meant another night in the shelters. Children called them fliegende Schlösser, flying castles. The name stuck, even among those who cursed them. You couldn't hate something that made the earth itself shake without respecting it a little. By early 1944, the Reich was burning from both ends. The factories that fed the Luftwaffe were rubble. The pilots who still flew fought through seas of debris and despair. The B-17s came in waves so thick they cast shadows miles long. German flak gunners said it looked like a moving ceiling of metal. Some fired until their barrels melted. Others simply watched, knowing nothing they did would stop it. Above 25,000 feet, the fortresses kept their slow, relentless pace. Engines howling, formation unbroken, each one a speck of silver dragging thunder behind it. They weren't fast, they weren't beautiful, but they were inevitable. The Luftwaffe had built its war on speed and precision. The Americans had built theirs on endurance and volume. One was art, the other was gravity. When the B-17s turned for home, the sun caught their wings, and for a moment the whole sky gleamed. The Germans below could only stare through the smoke and wonder how something that moved so slowly could destroy so completely. The truth was simple. Speed wins a duel. Persistence wins a war. The fortresses didn't need to chase victory. They brought it with them, 4 engines at a time, steady as time, cold as the stratosphere. German pilots learned to tell the difference between fear and respect. At first, they had mocked the flying fortress. Too heavy, too slow, too American. By 1944, the mockery had vanished. The moment they saw those glinting silver wings slicing across the high air, they felt something they hadn't felt before. Doubt. Not about their skill, not about their courage, but about survival itself. They were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe still had its aces, men like Barkhorn and Rahl, but the new recruits arriving from flight schools had barely 50 hours in the air. Some hadn't even fired their guns in training. The fuel shortages meant no practice, no formation drills, no second chances. They climbed into their Messerschmitts with empty stomachs and full fear, facing an enemy that came in squadrons so vast the sky turned silver. One German ace described it best in his diary. You don't fight them, you endure them. You attack and the air turns to metal. You dive and they follow with the patience of a glacier. You shoot and they keep coming. The B-17 didn't kill quickly. It killed relentlessly. Each fortress carried 10 men, and every one of them was ready to die in a blaze of return fire. You could knock out one gunner, maybe two, but the others would still be there. Even if you crippled an engine, it didn't matter. The bomber kept flying, limping back toward England, smoke trailing like a wound that refused to close. Some pilots swore they saw the same B-17S again weeks later, patched with fresh aluminum, the same nose art gleaming over the black scars. It was like shooting ghosts. The Germans began calling them Fliegende Panzer, flying tanks. The flat gunners had their own phrase, "You can't kill a mountain." But mountains could fall. When a B-17 went down, it didn't crash. It broke apart in slow motion. The wings tore away, the fuselage rolled like a dying whale, and parachutes blossomed too late, or not at all. The other bombers never stopped for them. There was no stopping. The mission had to go on. The survivors watched their friends fall through the clouds, then tighten formation, because that was the rule. Fill the gap. Every man in those crews lived by math. 10,000 feet to target, 2 minutes until flak, 1 second of deflection, a half-inch of armor between him and the end of his story. The engineers in Seattle had done their math too. Every rivet, every plate, every angle calculated for just enough strength to get the crew there and back once more. It was never about beauty. It was about function. It was about making a machine that could keep flying while dying. Berlin learned that lesson the hard way. In February 1944, the Americans came in daylight. The British had bombed by night, turning the city into a sea of flame. Now came the daylight raiders, dropping explosives so precisely that streets disappeared from maps. The fortresses flew through walls of flak so thick the sky looked like boiling ink. Some returned, missing whole sections of wing. Some didn't return at all, but the bombing continued, day after day, week after week. The Reich's confidence melted with its cities. Hitler had promised the German people that no foreign bomb would touch Berlin. The B-17S made that promise a joke. Civilians watched their neighborhoods vanish under clouds of dust, then heard the faint rumble fading westward. That sound, those droning engines, became the sound of inevitability. The Americans called it strategic bombing. The Germans called it the end. For the men inside the fortresses, the glory was long gone. It wasn't heroism anymore. It was routine horror. The intercom chatter had become mechanical. Altitude checks, gun jams, oxygen warnings, wounded reports. No one screamed anymore when they were hit. They just fell silent, and someone else took their place. The only thing louder than the engines was the counting, the endless counting of seconds until bomb release, until turning point, until the point of no return. The bombs didn't just destroy factories, they dismantled the German ability to fight. Each mission meant fewer fuel depots, fewer aircraft engines, fewer replacements for the aces who fell in flaming spirals. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was an economic weapon, a flying equation of attrition, and it was working. By spring 1944, Luftwaffe Command could no longer protect the heart of Germany. The Reich was running out of everything: fuel, steel, men, even hope. Some German fighter units took off only to land minutes later, out of fuel. The airfields were bombed daily. The hangars were empty. The pilots were exhausted. Still, the fortresses came. From England, from Italy, from every base within range. Like migrating steel birds, they crossed Europe daily. The sky was their domain now. The Americans had found a way to make gravity their ally, using altitude, formation, and endurance to turn slowness into inevitability. At 25,000 feet, the bombers were gods. From below, the people saw sunlight glitter off their wings like halos. The sky was silent, beautiful, and deadly. And then the sirens began. The B-17 didn't strike fast. It didn't sneak. It announced its arrival with that slow, dreadful hum. It gave you time to look up, to see your death coming from miles away. That was the psychological warfare. The waiting, the watching, the knowledge that you couldn't stop it. Children in Germany grew up under that sound. Farmers stopped their plows to watch the silver swarms crawl across the sky. Even the soldiers in the trenches fell silent to stare. The fortresses didn't just bomb cities. They erased morale. And the Luftwaffe could do nothing but die trying to stop them. By mid-1944, the B-17s had grown stronger still. Newer variants with longer range, better guns, stronger armor. They were escorted now by P-51 Mustangs, sleek silver predators that ripped through German defenses like knives. The hunters had become the hunted. Luftwaffe aces, who had once dominated the skies, now found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outclimbed. The fortress no longer needed to fight alone. The last illusions of German air superiority burned away over Leipzig, Kassel, Munich. The sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to industry. The age of the individual ace was over. The age of the machine had begun. The B-17 was more than a bomber. It was the sound of the future. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful. But from 25,000 feet, it didn't need to be. It brought hell methodically, predictably, perfectly. The Germans had built fighters that danced. The Americans had built fortresses that endured. And in the end, the dancers died on the floor. Because at that altitude with those guns, speed didn't matter. Persistence did. And persistence fell like rain, one bomb at a time, until the Reich was ash and silence. By the summer of 1944, the sky above Europe belonged to the United States Army Air Forces. It didn't happen in one day, or one raid. It happened through repetition, the slow grind of missions, the drone of engines that never stopped, the endless rhythm of takeoffs at dawn and smoke by dusk. Every time a German city disappeared beneath clouds of dust, another squadron was already forming on English runways, engines roaring, checklists repeating, bombs loaded. The B-17 wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a system, thousands of them, built by thousands more, operated by a continent-sized machine that didn't know fatigue. German commanders realized too late what that meant. You could destroy a fortress, but you couldn't destroy the idea of the fortress. You could shoot one down, even 100, but more would come, each identical, each perfectly replaceable, each flown by men who had never seen the faces of those who died before them. That was the true horror, the industrial rhythm of war. The Americans didn't need heroes. They had procedure, they had replacement parts, they had time. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, was running on fumes, literally. Aviation fuel was rationed to the point where fighters took off with tanks half full. Pilots were ordered to glide home if they could. Ground crews stripped dead planes for metal. Some airfields didn't even have spare tires anymore. Aces with 200 kills sat idle, watching fortresses crawl past at 30,000 feet, untouchable. On the ground, German civilians had learned the meaning of the word fortress. They used to run to windows when they heard the sirens, just to see the glint of sunlight on the bomber's wings, a strange, awful beauty in the sky. Then the sirens grew too familiar. The novelty faded, replaced by exhaustion. The people stopped counting the waves. There were too many. The sky had turned mechanical. From below, the B-17 looked slow. From inside, it was anything but. At full throttle, every engine screamed. At 2,400 revolutions per minute, the metal vibrating so violently it blurred vision. The airframe flexed and groaned, rivets rattling loose. It was like flying inside a living beast that refused to die. The crew could feel every hit, bullets slamming through the wings, flak-punching holes the size of fists, but the ship kept going. They named them with gallows humor: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909, Little Miss Mischief. They painted women, devils, and poker hands on the noses like charms against death. By the time they landed, those smiling pinups were often blackened with soot, torn with shrapnel, eyes missing, lips burned off. The bombers returned home like wounded animals, dragging themselves back to the den. Each mission was another page of statistics: sortie numbers, losses, tonnage dropped. But behind those numbers were men. 19-year-old tail gunners who froze to death in their stations, pilots who flew home with dead co-pilots beside them, medics who ran out of morphine halfway through patching holes in the fuselage. The survival rate on early missions was barely 50%, yet they kept going, not for glory, for momentum. By late 1944, the fortresses weren't just bombing factories. They were obliterating infrastructure, railways, bridges, oil fields. They were suffocating Germany's ability to move, to eat, to fight. Every pound of bombs dropped was another artery cut. Hitler's empire was bleeding out from altitude. The Germans tried new weapons, jet fighters, guided rockets, long-range flak. None of it changed the math. The jets were fast but fragile. They needed runways that no longer existed. The rockets were terrifying but few. The flak gunners were brave but blind. You can't stop a flood with bullets. In January 1945, with Berlin surrounded by ruin, the last functioning squadrons of the Luftwaffe were thrown into the air. They found nothing to defend but smoke. When they looked up, the contrails of the fortresses stretched across the horizon like white scars. No one called them slow anymore. The air itself belonged to them. Even the German generals began to admire their enemy. Albert Kesselring, a Luftwaffe field marshal, told his staff, "If I had those bombers, I would never lose a war." He wasn't exaggerating. The B-17 had rewritten the meaning of strategy. It wasn't just a weapon of destruction. It was proof that America could turn steel, oil, and labor into dominance. It was war by multiplication. The surviving pilots in Germany knew it too. When captured, they spoke about the fortresses with something like reverence. They talked about the sound first, that deep, constant hum that filled the air hours before the bombs fell. It was the soundtrack of defeat. It was the mechanical voice of inevitability. In April, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the B-17S flew one last great mission, not to destroy but to finish. Bridges, rail depots, fuel dumps, anything that could move an army. The flak was still thick, but it didn't matter. Nothing could stop the momentum now. And then, it was over. The fortresses that had once darkened the skies over Germany now sat in neat rows on English runways, engines silent, canopies open. The crews packed their gear and went home. Some hugged the wings, as if saying goodbye to a friend that had kept them alive against all reason. Others walked away without looking back. The wreckage of the Reich lay below them, a monument to arithmetic. In the aftermath, when captured Luftwaffe officers were asked what had broken them, they didn't mention tanks or infantry. They said it was the fortresses. Not their speed, not their beauty, but their persistence. They kept coming. Every day. Every sky. One German colonel summed it up in a single sentence during interrogation. You could fight a man. You could not fight the sky. And that was the truth of it. The B-17 didn't win by being faster or smarter or sleeker. It won by existing in numbers so vast, by enduring pain so great, that resistance itself became irrelevant. It started as a slow, bulky bomber, the kind men laughed at. It ended as the sound of the world changing. When the B-17S flew home for the last time, their shadows crossed the ruins of the cities they'd once destroyed. The engines faded into silence, the sky cleared, and below, the ashes whispered the final verdict. The Germans thought it was too slow, but it was never a race. It was an execution carried out after the war. The airfields of England turned silent. Rows of B-17S sat abandoned, their silver skins dull beneath the rain, tires sinking slowly into the mud. The engines that once shook Europe were cold now. Mechanics who'd worked 18-hour shifts during the bombing campaign stood smoking in the drizzle, looking at the machines they'd built and realizing they were relics already. The war had ended faster than anyone could believe, and the fortresses, symbols of destruction and endurance, were suddenly obsolete. Some were melted down, cut into scrap to make cars and refrigerators for a new piece. Others were flown back to the United States to be sold for pennies on the pound. A few were saved for museums, their bullet holes patched, and their bomb bays sealed, displayed as icons of victory. The men who had flown them walked through those exhibits years later with their children and said nothing. How do you explain to someone what it was like inside those walls of steel, where the air burned and froze at the same time? The veterans never forgot the sound. Decades later, when a radial engine fired up at an air show, they'd stop mid-sentence. The rhythm of 4 engines at full power still reached somewhere deep inside them. It wasn't nostalgia. It was muscle memory. The vibration of the controls, the weight of the oxygen mask, the smell of gun oil and burnt powder. The ghosts never left. Many of them tried to describe what it was like, but the words never worked. It was like living inside thunder, one said. Another simply shrugged, loud, cold, and long. They remembered the endless climb through fog and flak, the sunlight breaking above the clouds, the sudden silence when the intercom went dead. They remembered the taste of fear that never left their tongues. In Germany, the memory of the fortresses lingered too, though in a different way. The children who had hidden in basements grew up with that sound imprinted in their bones. Some became historians, others engineers. They studied those aircraft the way one studies natural disasters, trying to understand how something so slow could have destroyed so much. One German pilot, interviewed in the 1960s, said it simply, "We fought men before, but against the B-17, we fought a nation." He wasn't wrong. Each fortress carried the labor of thousands, designers in Seattle, riveters in Kansas, farmers growing the fuel, sailors bringing it across the ocean. When a German fighter attacked a B-17, it wasn't facing 10 men. It was facing America itself. In the post-war years, Boeing engineers dissected the lessons learned from the fortress. The B-29 came next, sleeker, faster, pressurized for higher altitude. But it was built on the bones of the B-17, the principles, strength through structure, power through redundancy, would define aviation for decades. The jets that followed owed their lineage to the lumbering giant that had once been called too slow. Even the Soviets studied captured fortresses. They measured the rivets, traced the wiring, admired the craftsmanship. The idea of a heavy, high-altitude, long-range bomber became the model for modern warfare. In a way, every strategic bomber that followed, B-52, Tu-95, even the stealth bombers of the future, carried the ghost of that first fortress within them. But the most haunting legacy wasn't mechanical. It was moral. The war had forced humanity to look at destruction as arithmetic. The B-17 had turned war into a process, a system that could be scaled, perfected, automated. You didn't need hate to drop bombs from 6 miles up. You only needed coordinates. From that altitude, cities looked like blueprints, and blueprints didn't bleed. Some historians called it progress. Others called it the beginning of something darker, a detachment from consequence. The pilots called it necessity. "We didn't start the fire," one said years later. "We just dropped it." There were moments, though, when the distance vanished. When the bomb bay doors opened and the men saw the fire rising toward them, when they could smell it even through the oxygen masks, that's when it hit. They weren't gods. They were just men in tin cans, killing from the edge of space and praying it would end the war sooner. When peace finally came, many of those same airmen couldn't sleep without the drone of engines. Silence was too loud. They missed the rhythm, the sense of purpose that only fear could give. Some drank, some worked themselves numb, some became teachers and never spoke of it again. But all of them carried that same invisible weight, the knowledge that victory had come at 30,000 feet, one bomb at a time. In Germany, the ruins became gardens. Cities rebuilt. Streets were renamed. The people learned to look up at the sky again without flinching. But every spring, when the contrails of passenger jets streaked across the clouds, old men would pause for a moment. The patterns looked the same. The sound, softer now, still carried the echo of something ancient and mechanical, a ghost of thunder. In museums across both continents, the B-17s still sit quietly, their aluminum skins polished to mirror shine. Tourists run their hands along the fuselage, unaware of the lives it once contained. Kids press their faces to the gun turrets, pretending to shoot invisible enemies. The smell of oil and dust lingers. If you listen closely inside those narrow halls, you can almost hear the engines warming up, the nervous laughter of the crew, the intercom crackling with a single phrase, "Bombs away." And when you step outside, the silence feels different, heavy, somehow, because you realize that this was what fear used to sound like. Not the scream of a dive bomber, not the whistle of a shell, but a calm, steady hum from 25,000 feet. The hum of a machine that moved too slow to dodge, too strong to die, and too sure of its mission to stop. The Germans thought the fortress was a relic, a brute built by amateurs who didn't understand air combat. They thought speed and precision would win the sky. But the sky belonged to whoever could stay there longest, whoever could endure the cold and the noise and the terror and still come back for another day. The B-17 didn't conquer Germany by being faster. It conquered by refusing to quit. When the last operational fortresses were retired in 1959, a few old Luftwaffe veterans attended the ceremony. One of them, white-haired and stooped, walked up to the American pilot standing beside the plane and offered his hand. He said, "We called it the flying coffin, but it was our coffin, not yours." That line stayed with the pilot for the rest of his life, because he knew it was true. The B-17 had started as a punchline. It ended as the sound of history itself, slow, relentless, unstoppable. The hum of justice falling from 25,000 feet,